Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. This is the second part of our in-depth exploration of the Merovingians with Professor Simonetta Torresi, which began last week. In this episode, we will take you even deeper into the heart of the Marche region, where Morrovalle emerges as a possible original center of Europe, a powerful, structured, wealthy, and mysterious city whose archaeological and toponymic traces challenge modern maps and the official history. A story that intertwines history, archaeology, genealogy, and myth, showing that what we consider marginal may, in reality, have been fundamental to European history. To truly understand the origin of Europe, one must take a step that may seem simple at first glance, but is actually profoundly destabilizing. Question the maps. Not only geographical maps, but the mental maps with which we have been educated to read the continent's history. Because the story we have been told is linear, orderly, almost reassuring. A story in which peoples come from afar, conquer, replace other peoples who mysteriously disappear, leaving space for new identities, as if Europe had been, for centuries, a vast empty space crossed by people without deep roots. But what happens if this pattern no longer holds? What happens if we discover that many of those peoples considered invaders were actually indigenous, and that the names by which we identify them today do not indicate a distant origin at all, but a change of era, power, or language? The reconstruction proposed by Simonetta Torresi starts precisely here, from the idea that Europe was not born where we have been told, and that its original heart may lie in territories that today we consider peripheral, marginal, almost secondary compared to the grand official narrative. Today, when we say the word Asia, we immediately imagine a distant continent, separate, distinct from Europe by firm and impassable borders. Yet, in ancient sources, this distinction simply did not exist. Asia, in remote eras, was not elsewhere. It was a real, concrete, localized land. And in the Marche, Asia was the land of the ACI. This is not a symbolic or mythological interpretation, but a precise territorial designation. An area delimited by two rivers we still know today, the Esino and the Aso. Between these two watercourses stretched what the sources call the enclosure of the ACI. And it is precisely within this enclosure that a place emerges destined to become central in this alternative reconstruction of European origins, Morrovalle. According to tradition, the foundation of Morrovalle is linked to the arrival of a prince of the ACI. The upper part of the settlement, called Morro, would derive from the prince's name, the lower part, Valle, from the name of his father. This division is not merely narrative or legendary. It is a structure reflected in the territory, in the toponymy, in the names of places and surrounding watercourses. In the territory of Morrovalle, in fact, numerous streams appear with names like Asola, preserving an extremely ancient linguistic memory, hardly attributable to chance. But it is when one goes beneath the surface of the land that the official narrative begins to show its most evident cracks. During relatively recent works related to the installation of gas pipelines in the Burella district of Morrovalle, an archaeological discovery of enormous importance came to light: an impressive number of Picene tombs. Not just a few isolated burials, but dozens and dozens of tombs, all circular, with a clearly Eastern-oriented layout. Smaller than the famous monumental tomb of Bidya, but organized according to a consistent, dense, and repeated pattern. Now, there is a fundamental rule in archaeology that rarely admits exceptions. Where there is such a high concentration of tombs, there must have existed a city, not a temporary camp. not a marginal settlement, but a stable, structured, populous inhabited center. Yet today, almost nothing remains of this city. People who attended schools in Morrovalle in the 1970s and 1980s remember that teachers made children draw Roman floors found between Trodica and Morrovalle. Visible, concrete artifacts studied in school. Today, nothing is known about those floors. We are not talking about millennia ago, not a distant and nebulous past, but discoveries made only a few decades ago vanished without leaving a trace. Historical sources add further unsettling elements. Father Costantini, through his itineraries, clearly mentions the existence of a Roman road crossing Morrovalle, at least in the upper part of the city, the Moro, distinguishing it from the lower area, Valle. Foreign authors also confirm the importance of the place. The German historian Theodor Mommsen, who studied the Roman period in Italy extensively, mentions Morrovalle in a letter, speaking of the existence of a Magnus Thesaurus Mons, a large storehouse, a place of accumulation and value. But perhaps the most shocking element concerns what no longer exists. In 1884, a monumental mausoleum, about 13 meters wide and 5 meters deep, was demolished. Inside this structure was a travertine chest containing 2 marble urns with the ashes of individuals of the highest rank. The funerary equipment described in the sources is impressive. A metal helmet with a white diamond, armor with 24 precious stones, swords, bows, arrows, medallions, gold rings, a metal-covered seat, asbestos sheets, cups of gold and onyx. These objects do not belong to the burial of an ordinary notable, but to figures of extraordinary political and symbolic power. And here history begins to intertwine with legend. If in the first part we saw the emergence of a lost, powerful, structured, and surprisingly wealthy city in the heart of the Marche, now it is necessary to take the next, most delicate and destabilizing step, to understand who actually lived in these places and what role they played in the great game of European power. Because Morrovalle, at this point, can no longer be considered a local anomaly or an isolated case. Too many clues, too coherent with each other, link it to a much wider network, involving names, dynasties, and capitals we are used to placing elsewhere. And here a key name comes into play: Metz. In the official historical narrative, Metz is a city in northeastern France, capital of Austrasia, one of the Merovingian kingdoms. A location that is taken for granted, rarely questioned, as if it were a natural fact. But what happens if we stop considering Metz as a fixed point on a modern map and start reading it as a political function, a center of power, a symbolic place even before being geographical? According to Simonetta Torresi's reconstruction, Metz was not up there in northern Europe at all, but in the heart of the Marche, precisely in the area of Morrovalle. A hypothesis that at first glance may seem excessive. But it begins to hold when sources are observed without forcing them into the current geography. Because Morrovalle, as we have seen, shows all the characteristics of a capital: wealth, monumentality, high-level tombs, Roman infrastructure, strategic roads, and above all, continuity of power. One of the most revealing elements concerns Hildegarda, one of Charlemagne's most important wives. Not a secondary consort, but the mother of children who would become emperors. Sources tell us that Hildegarda expressly requested to be buried in Metz. This fact is considered certain. Yet in the territory of Morrovalle, a funerary urn attributed to one of Charlemagne's wives was discovered. The artifact is now lost, but the documentation confirming its existence remains. Here arises a question that official historiography tends to avoid. Why would one of Charlemagne's wives be buried in the Marche, if Metz was really in France? The answer becomes surprisingly simple if Metz was not in France. Renaissance sources add a crucial piece. In 1597, Andrea Bacci, in his Naturalis Venerum Historia, writes that Morrovalle was fortified by Charlemagne as a garrison against Saracen incursions. The very name of the place derives from Murus and Vallum, meaning wall and fortification. It is not a random village, but a strategic stronghold, built or reinforced directly by one of the most powerful men in European history. And so the question is completely reversed. It is not Morrovalle that must explain Charlemagne's presence. It is Charlemagne who finally finds a coherent location through Morrovalle. At this point, the dynastic line becomes essential. Before being called Carolingians, Charlemagne's descendants were known as the Pippins. This is not a nominal detail, but a decisive genealogical clue. According to documented research reported by Simonetta Torresi, the Pippin family derives directly from the Roman Emperor Pupienus. His funerary slab, found in fields near Macerata, is today preserved in the courtyard of the town hall. This means that the Roman imperial line was never broken, but transformed, adapted, and redefined over time, remaining rooted in the same territory. The Pippins were not usurpers. They felt entitled to rule because they were descendants of emperors. And that is why Pepin the Short could depose the last Merovingian king without destroying the system. It was not a rupture, but a transfer of power within the same elite. There is also an element that makes the northern location of the Merovingians increasingly implausible: the network of marriages among royal houses. Clovis, the first king of the United Franks, initially married a Frankish Aryan woman, from whom Thierry, the future king, was born. He later married Clotilde, a Roman Christian. One of Clovis' daughters married a Visigothic king. A sister of Clovis married Theodoric the Great, Ostrogothic king of Ravenna. Now, all this raises a practical, before historical, question. Does it make sense to imagine continuous movements of thousands of kilometers in an era without adequate infrastructure, without safe roads, without fast communication? Or is it more logical to think that these ruling families lived in contiguous territories, moving within the same geographical area? If the center of everything had been central northern Italy, and in particular the Marche, then these marriages become not only plausible but natural. According to this reading, Austrasia and Neustria were not vast European kingdoms, but initially circumscribed territories. Austrasia represented the eastern area of the kingdom, facing the sea. Neustria, literally new territories, indicated areas gradually conquered. At the origin, the core was in the Marche. Only later did the influence extend elsewhere. The Ripuarian Franks perhaps occupied other areas, like Emilia-Romagna. Around these nuclei, a multitude of peoples coexisted, overlapped, and continuously redefined themselves. And here collapses one of the most fragile pillars of school historiography: the idea that Italy, after Rome, was an empty land, crossed by hordes of barbarians. If that were true, where did the inhabitants of Roman cities go? Why does every new people win without ever encountering resistance? The proposed answer is as simple as it is shocking. They were the same populations, with different names, in different eras, under different powers. We close the circle, without rushing, without slogans. Letting history and myth speak together again as they once did. At this point in the journey, one thing is clear. The history of the Merovingians cannot be read as a simple succession of ineffectual kings, surpassed by more efficient administrators. This is a reductive narrative, constructed retrospectively, which does not hold when compared with the density of links, symbols, and continuity we have seen emerge. The fall of the Merovingians is not the end of a dynasty. It is a transformation. And it is precisely at the moment when history seems to break that legend comes into play. According to official tradition, Dagobert is the last great Merovingian king. After him, the dynasty slowly fades until it is replaced by the Carolingians through the coup of Pepin the Short. But there is another narrative thread, older and more resilient than generally believed, which tells a different story. A story in which a son of Dagobert, Sigebert, survived internal wars, taken away from the violence of power struggles, and led to safety as a lost king. Not a defeated ruler, a withdrawn ruler. Historiography calls the last Merovingians Roisfanians, do-nothing kings. Inert figures, without real power, left as empty symbols while others governed in their place. But what if this inactivity was not weakness, but choice? If abandoning visible power was a conscious act, a renunciation of a kind of kingship already emptied, to preserve another, older and deeper? Here the narrative changes tone, and it resonates with a universal archetype, the Fisher King. In medieval and pre-Christian tradition, the Fisher King is a wounded figure. He no longer rules a prosperous kingdom, but a land rendered sterile by his own wound. He is a king who does not reign institutionally, but guards. He guards the Grail. He guards knowledge. He guards an origin. According to some symbolic readings, this king descends from a sacred line, connected to Jesus himself, or at least to a kingship not based on dominion, but on transmission. And here the legend of the Merovingians intertwines with something greater. If the last of the Merovingians was not defeated, but chose to disappear, then his figure resembles the Fool of the Tarot far more than a fallen king. The Fool has no throne, no armies, no palace. He carries a bundle. A dog follows him. A journey without apparent purpose. Yet he is the only card that can traverse all the others. He is the only one not trapped by the system. In this light, the end of the Merovingians is not a historical defeat, but an initiatory passage. This episode does not close anything. It opens questions. It opens perspectives. It opens a different way of looking at maps, names, genealogies. As Simonetta Torresi says, the evidence exists. It is documented. It is interconnected, but it requires time and attention, and the courage to accept that what we believed marginal may have been fundamental. The history of the Merovingians, perhaps, is not the story of a defeated dynasty. It is the story of a legacy that chose not to be seen anymore. And like all truly powerful things, it continues to act precisely in silence. The history we know does not always tell everything. Sometimes, the most surprising truths hide where we least expect them, among legends, forgotten tombs, and names that change over time. If this episode has made you see Europe with different eyes, the journey is not over. History continues to speak, and we will continue to listen, map by map, clue by clue, with Professor Torresi, here on Compelling Topics.